Hi everyone, welcome to the lion tutorial. This is part 1. In this video we'll paint the background, the mane and the eyes in. This is the reference photo that I used to paint the lion. This photo was taken by Gloria Anderson and I downloaded it from Wildlife Reference Photos. If you'd like to download this photo yourself, you can buy a subscription from Wildlife Reference Photos for $10, and that allows you to buy 5 photos within 30 days. I've put a link to the photo on the supplies list. I'm going to paint on a piece of Arches cold pressed watercolour paper. This was a piece that I cut off my roll that I've got. It ended up being 56.5 centimetres by 37 centimetres. So I've stretched the paper and attached it to my gator board. You can see it goes almost all the way to the edge of the gator board. And I've got it in landscape orientation. Before I painted it, I did a graphite study, and that helped me to work out my paint edges and what I was going to do with the background. So after I did that, I then did a colour study on another piece of Arches paper, a smaller one, and that helped me work out my colours and it helped me work out my technique, how I was going to paint it. So I used both the graphite study and this colour study to help me paint my main painting. On my palette here, I'm squirting out some French ultramarine. This is burnt umber. Some gold ochre now. This is Windsor orange. And this is indigo. And this colour here that I used on another painting is permanent rose. I'm also going to use some lamp black. And 2 other colours I get out later are sepia and Daniel Smith's Pyrrole orange. I'm going to start painting the background. So I've got a 2-inch flat brush here and this is gold ochre. So I want to put a bit of water with that so that it's not so thick. I also want some permanent rose, but the permanent rose has gone hard because I used it on another painting, so I need to reactivate that with some water. So I'm getting those 2 colours ready because that's what I'm going to start the background with. Okay, so with my clean brush, I can start painting some water onto the side of the lion's head, and then I take it off into the background. So I take it up to the face or the edge of the face and over the top of the mane. So I'll get water on this bottom right corner of the painting. I might take it down underneath the chin as well. So just underneath this area here. I'll keep the water off the chin because I don't want to paint that just yet. Okay, so that's my background on the right hand side there, all nice and wet. It's evenly covered with water. I dab off the excess water that's on my brush and then I pick up the gold ochre paint. And then I start to paint it onto the wet paper. Okay, so now I want to take it a little bit closer to the lion. So I'll start to paint it onto the mane here. Just taking it up carefully around the side of the face there. you do this, make sure your paper's nice and wet so that you don't get any hard edges forming in it. It gives you a bit more time to get the paint on. Now I'm going to wash the paint out of my brush and I'll pick up some permanent rose with it. And I'll paint that through here where I've left that little white patch. Okay, now I want some water on this side, not on the mane this time. I'm going to just paint it around the outside edge of the mane. Looks like I've still got a bit of the paint left in the brush. That's alright, it won't matter. I'm going to take it over the top of the ear here. So it's all the way over the top of the lion and it comes into the mane a little bit. Then I start with the gold ochre again. Just take it beside that first section of mane. I'll take it up a bit further, but I think I'll stop there because I want the pink to go through there. So I'll get some permanent rose and put it through that section. So this is permanent rose now. I washed the gold ochre out of my brush before I picked it up. And now I'll get some more gold ochre. I'll continue that on. I've got it coming down onto the top of the lion's mane. Now I'm softening that edge with some water. I think I'll leave some white paper showing there. This other side is still wet, so I just want to put a bit more permanent rose there. So that needs to dry now. My thoughts when I was painting the background were that I would have the pink flowing through this area here. And then this front section of the lion's mane I would paint fairly light, and that light area would be echoed up here. So I'd get a crisscross movement through the painting that I thought would make it look interesting. I've taken a photo of my painting at this stage and I've included it here for you to download. So I hope it helps you when you paint your background. Okay, my background is completely dry. Now I want to start painting the mane. So I'm wetting it with water and I'll work on the wet paper. I wet past the edge of the mane, so I take the water out further than where the mane will end, and that will keep my paint edges soft. I'll use my number 8 round brush to paint the hair on. I'll use gold ochre, but I want it not quite so watery, so I got a bit extra out there. It's a bit thicker now. And I'll paint that onto the wet paper. So beside the face, and then I'll pull it out down here as well. So I don't want to fuss with the paint, I just want to get it on there as quickly as I can and not fiddle with it too much. I'm leaving the background colour showing through. Sometimes I'll put the paint on the paper and then I'll wash the paint out of my brush and I'll use the brush to spread it around, the paint that's already on the paper. Now I want a bit of burnt umber. . got a little stray hair on it. I put that on a bit thick, so I just picked up a bit of water on the tip of my brush, and then I can spread it out now. So you want soft paint edges here. If you find that your paper is starting to dry, you need to let it dry completely and then re-wet it and keep going. So it'll depend on how hot it is, wherever it is you're painting, how long the paper stays wet for you. So you can see I'm leaving the background showing through the mane. I'm not completely covering it. You can still see that permanent rose coming through there. I'm still using burnt umber here. Just spreading that pigment out a little bit. Sometimes it sits in a spot and it's a bit dark, so you can use your brush to spread it out. Now I think I'll get some permanent rose, and I'll put that on here where the permanent rose is showing through. You can see my paper's still nice and wet. Now I've got nothing on my brush. I'm using my brush to spread that paint out. Now I've got some more of the gold ochre on my brush. Softening the paint edge there. Now I want some burnt umber, but I want it to be a bit thicker, so not quite so watery. So my paper's still wet, but because this paint is a bit thicker and the paper is a bit drier now, the paint isn't spreading quite so far. It's tending to stay put where I put it, but it is still giving me those soft paint edges. Now I want some indigo, I think. My paper's still wet here, so that's indigo. Put it up beside the face here. And a little bit down here too. It's getting to the point where I should stop painting, I think. It's getting a bit dry. This is burnt umber, it's a bit thicker, so there's less water mixed into it. So now I'll come over to this side, I'll leave that other side to dry. So I want to wet this side as well. I've taken the water out further than I need it, so the line comes down there. So I've taken the water out wider than that, and that will keep the paint edges soft. I want soft edges down here as well, so I need to take the water in further there onto the mane itself. I start with some gold ochre again. So that's the side of the lion. Now I can do my little flicks and leave some of the background colour showing in places. And down the bottom here I wanted soft paint edges, so that's why I've put the water further over onto the white paper. So I've got my hard edges here, and this one down here is soft. Now I've got some burnt umber. My paper's still wet. I'm painting that over the top of the gold ochre. I don't really want to lose those light spots. So that goes over the top of the gold ochre paint. Still using burnt umber. This time it's got a bit more pigment in it, less water. I've got a few pencil lines still showing through my gold ochre, so I'll put this thicker, darker burnt umber over the top and that will disguise them. I've taken a photo of my painting at this stage and I've included it for you to download. This is Progress Photo 2. Okay, now I want to start painting the hair on the top of the mane. So I'm wetting it with water again. What I want to do is have some hard edges on the outside part of the mane. So these edges up here, I'm going to paint on dry paper. But this area here where I'm putting the water on, I'll have all soft edges there. This is gold ochre again. So I've got some hard edges on top of the head here. So still on wet paper here, but then when I pull the paint out past the water, I'll get my hard edges that I want. I've just turned my board so that I can pull these strokes towards myself, and I'm using my colour study here. So I'm not actually looking at the reference photo, I'm looking at my colour study. So this is gold ochre and I'm pulling it out onto the dry paper. So I'm pulling it from the wet area out onto the dry area. Okay, back around the right way, and I can lengthen some of them because they were a bit short. I've got a hard edge along here that I don't want, so a bit of water on my brush will take that off. And now I've got a bit more gold ochre. I'm painting that down the bottom of this shape, just against the head. Now I'm wetting this front section of the mane that comes down onto the head. And this is gold ochre again here. So I fill in that section and then I'll flick it out onto the dry paper. So this area just here is painted on dry paper. Now I'm going to get some Windsor orange. And I'll paint that on there while it's wet. On this section of the mane, I'm going to leave a little gap and then put some water on here. I want the edges of the mane to be hard, but I want the colour to bleed back into the mane. So there's some water. I'll show you what I mean now. So this is burnt umber on my brush. So I want the edge to be hard, but I want the paint to bleed back onto the mane. I've just picked up a bit more paint. I'm still using burnt umber. Down here where I'm working now, the paper is dry. I don't necessarily want a hard edge there, so I'll use my damp brush to soften that edge. Now I've got a bit more of the burnt umber on my brush. Just wanted to darken it slightly. Now I want some water along this edge. And this is burnt umber here as well. And I'll put some Windsor orange there as well. I've taken another photo of my painting at this stage and I've included it for you to download. This one is Progress Photo 3. Now I'm going to paint this top section of the mane just here. I'm going to wet the paper here, but I'll wet a larger section that I need so that I have soft paint edges around the outside edge of the shape that I'm going to paint. So I've wet past the area where I'll be putting the paint. I'm going to use indigo to begin with. And this indigo will sit underneath some lamp black that I paint on here later. If you don't have indigo, you could try something like Prussian blue or even Payne's grey. Payne's grey won't be quite as blue as this, but it would still work okay. Now I'm going to get my little saucer with lamp black on it, and that's going to go over the top of the indigo. So I still want to see the indigo, I don't want to completely cover that. So I'm trying to be fairly loose and free with my brush strokes. I don't want to fuss with it too much, but I will come back in a moment and I'll get some darker lamp black and I'll paint that over the top. I might put a few up here on the dry paper, a few little flecks. So the paper's dry there where I am now. This is a bit of water that I've got on my brush. So now, instead of using the watery lamp black that I just used, I'm going to wipe my brush over the pigment to get it really dark. So now the pigment is darker and not as watery. So it's a bit thicker or creamier, so it won't spread quite as far as it just did. And the paper has started to absorb some of the water as well, so the paint's not going to move as far. Okay, now I want to start painting in the hair on the ear. So again, I wet the paper with water. And here I've lost my pencil line, so I'll draw that back in. So I've taken the water around the outside edge of the ear because there's some hair behind the ear that I want to paint in. There's a little bit of orange hair behind the black hair, so I'll paint that in now. I think most of that gets covered up with black though later on. Okay, to repeat the indigo that I used on top of the head, I'll put some indigo here as well. You can see the paint's bleeding on the wet paper. I've got a hard edge around the outside perimeter of the ear, but the other edges are soft. The hair actually comes over the top of the ear as well, so I've just put a bit of water there too. Okay, so now I need some lamp black again. And I'll start up here on top of the ear. I use my brush right up on the tip to get those finer lines on the edge. And where it doesn't matter, I push down on the side. The indigo is still damp, it hasn't dried. I think I'll put my paint here so you can see me picking it up. So you can see it's still fairly wet, the paper. Might have a bit too much moisture on my brush. So I just dabbed it on a cloth. When you've got water on the paper and water in the paint, sometimes you might have too much water in your brush as well. So if I think I've got too much water in the brush, I'll dab the side of it on a cloth just to release some of the water that's in it. So I've got a combination of soft and hard edges there. Now I want it to be darker, so I'm wiping my brush over the pigment. And this will sit over the top of the lighter black. Just taking it into the ear a bit there to create more of a jagged edge. Push down when I want a thicker stroke, and then I come right up on the tip when I want that fine point. You might find it easier to turn your board when you do this and pull these strokes towards yourself. I'm struggling on doing it this way, but I probably should turn it. I find it easier when I pull the strokes towards myself rather than push them away from myself. Now I'm going to drop some water in there just to disturb it slightly. That creates those little watercolour blooms and it softens it slightly. Okay, I'll leave that to dry and I'll put a little bit more paint up here on the top section. So here I'm working on dry paper with lamp black. I'm painting negatively here. I'm trying to bring in a little tuft of fur that sits in front of the larger area of fur. So I'm going to soften that edge now, the top edge, just with some water on my brush, and that'll blend off into those longer strokes. So that has created some hard edges amongst all those soft edges. And I'm going to just put a few little flicks onto the dry paper here as well. Now I'm going to use a damp brush to soften this side of the line that I just made. And I'll paint a few more. So that's put some hard edges amongst all the soft edges. Moving down onto this front section of the mane, I'm painting some water on it. I'll use this same brush to paint on some watery gold ochre. When I say watery, it's not as dark as what I used on the rest of the mane. I want this area to be fairly light in colour, but I don't necessarily want it to be all white paper. So this is gold ochre, but it's got a bit of water mixed into it so that it's not too dark. I'm trying to leave a bit of white paper showing here and there. I'm not completely covering it. All I'm doing is getting some directional strokes in. Alright, now I want to mix some grey, so I'm just cleaning off my palette. I'll use French ultramarine and also some burnt umber. I'll mix the two together and that will give me a grey. If I want a warmer grey, I'll put more of the brown in it, but if I want a cooler grey, I'll put more of the French ultramarine in it. These are also good colours to make black if you want to make a black. Okay, I'll hold my brush back away from the ferrule, so back here, and that'll keep my brush strokes fairly loose. Paper's still wet. I'm going to take a bit of that grey up onto the chin. The chin's dry. That breaks up that edge there a bit. Just painting it underneath the chin and then I pull it down. Now I've got some more gold ochre. This time it's darker, so more pigment, less water. Now I'm washing the paint out of my brush and I want to soften the edge of the paint along the side of the face here. So that softens that paint slightly and makes it less of a hard edge against the face. I've taken a photo of my painting again. I've included this one for you to download as well. It's Progress Photo 4. Now I'm going to start painting in the ear. So I'll wet it with water first. And this is some burnt umber that I've got. Here I'm pulling it onto the paper to get that hard edge there. So just up here, I've got my hard edge that I've pulled onto the dry paper. Now I want some sepia on my palette. Sepia is a dark, opaque brown colour that I use quite often. So I'm going to put that colour just in here while the paper's wet. Now I'll get some more burnt umber, so a bit darker and thicker this time. And I dab that on here and there. While I'm here, I'll wet this area with some water and I'll paint some burnt umber on there as well. I'll get some more burnt umber. And I'll paint that on there. Bringing that down into the hard edge and letting it flow back over the top of the hair. Now I'm not sure I like that, so I'll use my damp brush to get rid of it. And I'll drop a bit more burnt umber in there. And now I've got some sepia as well. Okay, my ear has dried. I thought I might try and paint a few little hairs in here, but I thought I'd paint them in negatively. So I'm drawing in some hairs for myself to paint around. I'll just speed this up a little bit. I'm going to need a smaller brush to paint this area, so I'll get my number 2 out. This is sepia. And then I start to paint it in. Now it's fairly dark paint, but it's still got water mixed into it so that I can get it to flow off the brush. So all I'm doing is painting the spaces around those little hairs that I drew in. And this is my number 2 Da Vinci Maestro brush. So now I've got a hard edge on the outside. So I'm going to get my other brush with a bit of moisture on it and I'll soften the paint edge. So just here, I don't want a hard edge there. And then I'll keep going. So here again, I'll use my other brush, damp, to soften that paint edge. And again here, I'll soften the paint edge with my other brush. Up here, I want some water. I'm going to paint some sepia on there as well. So I'm dabbing that on again. Some more water here. I want to bring in that ridge around the outside edge, so I won't take the water all the way to the outer part of the ear. I'll get some burnt umber and I paint that around the outside edge, but I don't take it all the way out, I just take it to the edge of the water. And that gives me a hard edge on the left side or on the outer side and a soft edge on the inside of the ear. This is my little Rosemary & Co. eradicator brush. This is a flat brush. I'm going to soften a paint edge here that I don't like. So my paper is dry but the brush is wet. And I can gently rub at it. And that softens the paint edge there. And this is some sepia that I've got on my brush. Okay, now I want to start painting in the face. I want to get a layer of very pale gold ochre over the top. I'm not going to put the gold ochre on the white areas down near the nose, but I'll put it pretty much everywhere else. I won't wet the entire face at once because I don't think I would get it painted in before it dried, so I'll do it section by section. The other thing is down here, I don't want a hard edge, so I've just taken the water off into the mane there. I'll paint around the eyes, I won't paint them in. So I've extended the water into the mane down the left-hand side. Now I've got the very pale wash of gold ochre, so there's not a lot of colour in it. I just wanted to get rid of the white paper, but I don't want it to be too dark. Take it around the eye. And I'll keep the paint away from my water's edge so that I can join up with it with some more water. Now on this side I'm painting some water. Again, I'm going to take the water into the side of the mane, and that way I won't get a really hard edge down that side, which I don't really want. Take it around the eye and into the mane. And then on goes that pale wash of gold ochre again. Okay, now this area down here, more water. I have to be careful here because I don't want to get the water on the white parts. So this area here on the snout, I want to try and keep white. So I'll put the water on there, but I'll keep the paint off it. So the water will allow me to have soft paint edges where the gold ochre stops. Just here is white as well. I'm going to put the water there, but I won't put any paint there. Okay, on goes the gold ochre paint. I've taken it over the top of the nose. Here's where I've got to leave some white paper showing. So I don't want to cover that area. And then over here as well. Now the water that extends all the way over is ensuring that I get a soft edge here. If I'd stopped the water there, I'd end up with a hard edge, and I don't want a hard edge there. There's also a little white section on the side of the face that I need to reserve. I'm making sure I'm not getting any hard edges forming. Okay, I've got colour on the face and I've left these areas here white, which is what I want. The other thing I need to do is watch it as it dries, and if there's any lines forming, I need to rub them away. So keep an eye on it as it dries. Just out here I want to paint a hard edge on the mane, just a little section of it. So I'm drawing in a pencil line for myself. I'll wet the paper on the right hand side of the pencil line. That'll give me soft edges on the right hand side. And this is burnt umber. So that gives me a little hard edge there, which breaks up all the soft edges. I'm going to do the same thing down here. So a little bit of water in there. And burnt umber. Now I want to darken the colour down the side of the mane where it touches the face. So I'm wetting it with water. I'm wetting the mane side. And this is burnt umber. Now I don't necessarily want a hard edge here, like I said before, so I'm going to put this paint on and then I'll come back and soften the edge where it touches the face. Here I've got slightly darker pigment, so I've wiped my brush over the pigment that's on my palette rather than use the watery paint that I've mixed. Now I've got a hard edge along here and I don't necessarily want it to be hard like that. So I can use my damp brush now to wipe over it, and hopefully that will soften it slightly. I was thinking I might leave a section of it hard, but then I looked at it and I thought, no, I'll soften the entire line. So that bleeds back a little bit onto the face, and that's okay. I just want a soft edge there rather than a hard line. So that's given me a soft edge down the side, but up here where I am now, I want a hard edge. So I'm painting on dry paper here, and I've got burnt umber. And this is my number 5 brush, I think. Into this burnt umber, while it's wet, I'm going to drop some sepia. So here I've got some sepia. I wiped my brush over the pigment to get it fairly dark. I drop that on while it's wet. And this is my little number 2. Now I'm wetting on the right hand side of the face, just in from the mane. There's some mane that comes down right down in the middle of his forehead. So I want to just put a bit of a darker colour on the other side of it. So I've got sepia again. Pull that off onto the dry paper there, back up into the mane. And where I'm painting now, the paper is wet. Now I want some water up the top of this little section. And here I've got burnt umber. And again, it's fairly dark, so I've wiped my brush over the pigment. Now I've just taken the paint out of my brush and I'm going to use it to spread the paint where I want it. I've just picked up a bit more sepia too. I just wanted to darken that area slightly. It's still damp. I've just wet down the side of this line that runs down the middle of his face. And I've got some sepia here as well. So I've wet the right hand side of my pencil line. It's a bit dry there. I've hit the dry paper, so I softened it with the damp brush. Okay, I want to start painting in the eyes now. So I'm painting on dry paper here. I've got a touch of watery French ultramarine on my brush. Running it around the outside edge of the iris. I'll do the same thing over here. So there's not a lot of pigment, it's fairly watery. I think I also put a tiny little dot of masking fluid just to the left hand side of the pupil on each eye. I think I put it on, but I didn't film it. Now I want to mix a colour for the eye. So I'm thinking I'll use gold ochre and I'll put a bit of burnt umber into it. I thought gold ochre on its own might be a bit bright. So I think I'll use that. I'm painting on dry paper here and the French ultramarine has dried. And I think there you can see that tiny little dot of masking fluid to the left hand side of the pupil. Then I paint that same colour on the other side. To paint a shadow on the eye, I thought I'd mix some French ultramarine with gold ochre. That looks okay. So I'll use this to paint the darker colour that I see on the eye. I'll paint it on dry paper. And then I paint it on the other side as well. I'm going to paint it on the other side of the French ultramarine strip. I'm So that's on dry paper there as well. That's the same colour. Now I want some indigo. I'm going to paint that on the inner corner, and I'll run it underneath the eye as well and around the top. And this I'm painting on the dry paper as well. I run it underneath the eye and onto the other side. I'm also going to put a bit on the inside of the eye, or on the other side of that French ultramarine strip. And I'll take a bit over the top as well. I've got some water on my brush now and I'm running it along the edge. I thought I might try and soften the edge slightly, or make the paint bleed down away from the eye a little bit. I paint the same colour on the other side. So here I'm on dry paper as well. I run it underneath the eye here too. And then with my clean wet brush, I run that underneath to try and soften the edge slightly and make the paint bleed a little bit. I've just picked up my bigger brush with some water on it. I'm trying to make it a bit softer so that it's not such a hard, harsh line. I've taken it into the other corner and up over the eye again. And then I'll see if I can soften this line up here a bit too. I think I might be a bit late with that one. Everything is dry. Now I've got some lamp black that I'm painting over the top of the indigo in the corner of the eye. I've got a slightly wet brush here just with water, and I've just again tried to make that paint bleed slightly to give me that soft edge underneath. More black paint here in the corner. And now for the pupil. So I painted that on dry paper as well. Now some lamp black in the corner of this eye. Here the paper's dry as well. So all I'm doing is painting over the indigo, but you can still see the indigo. It's coming through around the edges. Taking my time, I'm not rushing. I'm holding the brush right up on the tip so that I get that fine point. Just teasing that paint around, doing it very carefully. And then I do the pupil as well. I I dried both of the eyes with my hairdryer to make sure they were completely dry. And now I've got my mechanical pencil and I'm using it to tidy up the shape of the eye. I can also use my waterproof black ink pen to tidy the shape of the little pupil. I also do the same thing on this other eye. Okay, so this is the end of part 1. I'll continue on in part 2.